He was an old man who sacrificed everything to raise two abandoned children he found shivering in the bitter cold. Years later, the world betrayed him, falsely accused of a crime, branded a liar and a thief. The judge was moments away from condemning him to life in prison, when the courtroom doors opened, and two figures stepped inside. What they revealed left every jaw on the floor. Walter Green was an aging black man who gave up all he had to raise two children he discovered in a freezing alleyway. Years later, his ruthless boss framed him for a crime, and the courtroom turned against him. Whispers spread like wildfire, painting him as a thief, a liar, a man undeserving of mercy. Bound at the wrists, with hope slipping through his fingers, Walter stood as the judge prepared to deliver his sentence. But just before the gavel struck, two figures emerged. And what they revealed left the room gasping. That winter cut sharper than any blade, slicing through thin coats and worn shoes. Small factory towns choked on smoke and steel, places where strangers hurried past one another, eyes down, ignoring whoever was left in the shadows. After a grueling shift, Walter Green, late 50s, weary, with a limp that never healed from decades in factory work, dragged himself through the streets. His boss never missed a chance to sneer, calling him too slow, too useless, lucky to have a job at all. Walter never fought back. He swallowed the insults, endured the pain, and kept his head lowered. That night, he passed a narrow alley behind a diner. The hum of freezer fans mixed with the howling wind, and there, huddled against a dumpster, were two children. Skin pale, shivering, their clothes nothing more than scraps draped over fragile bones. The boy held his younger sister tight, shielding her from the cold. Walter froze. He could have walked on, like everyone else. His boss's words echoed, "Don't waste your time on strays. You can barely feed yourself." And it was true, Walter's meals were scraps, his room barely warm. But looking at those children, something inside him pulled harder than hunger. He crouched, knees aching, and the children lifted their eyes far too old for their years. "You two got anywhere to go?" he asked quietly. They said nothing, only shook their heads. Walter sighed, his breath clouding in the night air. He knew too well what it meant to be discarded, unseen. He couldn't leave them. "Not tonight," he whispered, stretching out his calloused hand. "Come on." The boy hesitated, but the girl's tiny fingers slipped into his palm, ice-cold, desperate. That was enough. By the time they reached his run-down apartment, neighbors peeked through cracked doors. "That fool," one muttered. "Old man can't pay his own bills. Now he's dragging strays in." Another scoffed. "He'll sink with them." Walter heard it all. He always did. But he kept walking, two fragile shadows following behind. Inside, his apartment was no sanctuary. Peeling wallpaper, a sagging couch, one rattling heater that made more noise than warmth. Still, he spread blankets on the couch, warmed some broth, and watched as the children devoured it like they hadn't eaten in days. That night, rubbing his aching leg, Walter thought of how his boss would mock him tomorrow, how his money would stretch thinner than ever. But one thing was certain, those children would not sleep on frozen pavement again. Not while he still breathed. With that vow, a bond was sealed, one that would echo louder than he could imagine. The days that followed were brutal. Walter worked in the steel factory, air thick with iron, machines pounding until his bones rattled. His boss, Mr. Harlan, thrived on cruelty. He'd wait until the floor fell silent, then bark across the hall. "Green. Even those orphans you dragged home probably work faster than you." The factory roared with laughter. Some laughed uneasily, others eagerly. But Walter never shouted back. He simply wiped his brow, and pushed on. Each insult weighed on him, but at night, the weight lifted. When he opened his apartment door, the children rushed to him. The boy Eli always carried a book, eager to read aloud what he'd learned in school. His sister Grace sat at the wobbly table with a dull pencil, sketching homes warmer than anything they'd ever known. Walter gave them his food when cupboards went bare. He stitched Eli's jacket with clumsy fingers, saved coins for Grace's shoes, and when the heater coughed its last breath, he pulled them close, pretending he wasn't freezing. Neighbors whispered in stairwells and corner shops. "He'll end up on the street with them," one woman muttered. A man sneered, "A black man raising two white kids? They'll turn on him the first chance they get." Walter heard it all, but he answered with silence. Instead, he poured his heart into Eli and Grace. He taught Eli how to change a tire, how to shake a hand with dignity. He showed Grace how to count coins, how to stand tall when the world tried to shrink her. Still, Harlan never let him forget his place. When Walter once asked for a single day off to take Grace to the clinic, Harlan sneered. "You're not their father. Stop playing hero, and get back to work." But Walter went anyway. He walked Grace to the clinic, hand steady on hers, knowing full well the cost. That night, when Harlan cut his pay in half, Walter folded the slip into his pocket, pretending nothing had changed. Years rolled on, sacrifice after sacrifice. The children thrived. Eli, sharp and determined, earned scholarships Harlan insisted he'd never deserve. Grace, once the quiet girl with her pencils, became a fierce debater, fearless when defending her odd little family. Walter's limp grew heavier, his back more bent, but his heart swelled with pride. He pinned Eli's letters from law school, and Grace's notes from journalism, onto his peeling wall, treasures brighter than gold. For the first time, he let himself believe kindness wasn't wasted, that maybe it grew roots and bloomed beyond him. But someone else had been watching, Mr. Harlan. The more Walter found joy in his makeshift family, the more bitterness ate at Harlan. He hated the sight of Walter walking a little taller, hated it with a venom that festered with age. He despised the whispers about orphans making something of themselves. To him, it was proof that Walter had stolen dignity he was never meant to have. Then one autumn morning, the trap was sprung. Walter returned home to find 2 policemen waiting at his door. Their uniforms were sharp, their eyes colder than the wind. From her window, a neighbor hissed, "Told you so." Always knew he'd end up in trouble. The officers stormed inside, tearing through his modest apartment. From beneath the couch cushion, they pulled out a small bag, stuffed with cash and factory equipment stamped with company logos. Walter's chest tightened. He had never seen it before. Within hours, metal cuffs bit into his wrists. At the factory gates, Harlan stood with folded arms, smirk wide, as Walter was led away. "Guess kindness doesn't pay after all," he sneered, loud enough for all to hear. A few laughed, while others just turned away. The courtroom reeked of varnish and dust. Walter sat hunched, shoulders once strong, now sagging. Prosecutors painted him as a desperate old man who stole to survive. Witnesses, men Harlan had quietly bought, swore they'd seen him sneaking into storage rooms. The benches filled with bystanders whispering. Knew he was too good to be true. Those kids don't even know who he really is. Walter stayed silent. He longed to cry out, but a lifetime of swallowing insults held his tongue. He thought of Eli and Grace, yet couldn't bear to drag them into his shame. Better they stayed away. Better they never saw him like this. When the judge's gavel struck, declaring Walter faced a possible life sentence, the room seemed to close in. The air thinned, the walls pressed tight, and Walter lowered his eyes with one bitter thought. Maybe Harlan was right. Maybe a man like him was never meant to rise above his place. And then, the doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. 2 figures entered, steady, certain. Their eyes locked on the man sitting at the defendant's table. Eli and Grace. No longer the trembling children Walter once carried home, but adults, sharpened by the very sacrifices he thought had gone unnoticed. The crowd stirred. Whispers turned to gasps. For the first time, Harlan's smirk cracked. Walter's chest clenched. He hadn't wanted them there. But as Eli dropped a thick stack of files onto the table, and Grace lifted a recorder, her gaze sweeping the gallery, Walter realized something he had never dared to believe. His kindness had come full circle, and the fight was far from finished. The courtroom buzzed with unease as Eli straightened his tie and stepped forward. Gone was the timid boy who once hid in alleys. He stood tall, voice steady, introducing himself as Walter's defense attorney. Documents slammed onto the table, evidence stacked high. Grace moved into the gallery, recorder light blinking red. She wasn't a spectator. She was chronicling every detail. Her words had already rattled powerful names. Now, they were aimed squarely at Harlan. The prosecution pressed on. But Eli cut their case apart, layer by layer. Witnesses who swore they'd seen Walter steal crumbled under questioning. One faltered, admitting he'd only heard rumors. Another tripped over his own story. Eli's questions exposed every lie, every crack widening under the pressure. Then came the bombshell. Grace rose, requesting to present her report. It revealed Harlan's history of wage theft, harassment, falsified accounts at the factory, evidence she had uncovered through months of investigation. Murmurs swept the courtroom. Harlan's face flushed red, fists clenching tight with rage. Walter sat frozen, eyes stinging. He had thought the children he saved had long outgrown him, moved on to brighter worlds. Yet here they were, wielding the very fire he had unknowingly passed down. The judge leaned back, pen tapping as he weighed the storm unraveling before him. "It seems," he said finally, voice sharp, "this case was built on manipulation." His gaze cut from Walter to Harlan. "The charges are dismissed." The room erupted, gasps, applause, jeers at Harlan as he stormed out in defeat. Eli placed a steady hand on Walter's shoulder. Grace moved beside him, whispering softly, "You don't have to carry it alone anymore, Dad." That single word, Dad, rang louder than the gavel that freed him. Neighbors who once mocked fell into silence. Reporters scribbled furiously. And Walter, old and weary, straightened his back, lifting his eyes to meet the world. He had once pulled 2 children out of the cold. Now, 20 years later, they had pulled him out of a cage. Because kindness doesn't die. It waits. It grows. And when the time comes, it saves. Walter thought the battle was over. But as the crowd roared, and Harlan stormed out in disgrace, none of them realized a darker truth still waited outside those courtroom doors. And when it finally came to light, everything they believed about justice would be shaken again.